Okay, so, so everybody, thank you very much for showing up, and a special thanks to you, Chip, for showing up in our Danish Zoom room. Now, for those of you who haven't met Chip before or haven't heard of him before, I would just like to say a couple of words. And please correct me, Chip, if I'm wrong. Chip Chipman was or is one of the oldest friends of Sydney Banks, together with his wife, Jan. And I think it's correct to say that you were among the first pupils that Sid was teaching, and that you really have, if anybody has, you have really followed the development of the 3P on a global level. You have been traveling extensively all over the world, talking about the principles in what I consider a beautiful way because you're very soft-spoken, and you really know how to cheat the intellect. So from that point of view, we are very happy to have you here. Another thing I would like to say, there are a couple of days in one's life that you remember very well. One of them could be the wedding day. Another could be the day when you stop smoking. And a third day could be the day then when you, for the first time, fall out of your thinking. And to me, that happened in Salt Spring Island during one of your classes back in November 2014. And it was indescribable, falling into a space that was the epitome of perfection, with nothing to do, but still full of potential. And I remember how the atmosphere in the room with the 40 participants in your class at that time, how the atmosphere was almost tangible, so filled with love, so filled with compassion, that it lifted everybody there to new heights. It was an amazing experience. And I'm very grateful both to you and Elsie. And I think it was Bill and Linda that was there at that time for what you did. And when we get out on the other side of the Corona epidemic or pandemic, I can only recommend all of you to the extent that it is possible, to visit Salt Spring Island and attend one of these classes, because it is really, it is like going back to something original, something pure, which incidentally, I think you have put in words beautifully in the genesis of the 3 principles. So to me, you are the real thing, and I am so happy to see you here in our Zoom room. And I think that with these words, I would like to pass the word over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Christian, for that beautiful introduction. And thanks for setting this up and for all the work that you two have done to move this throughout the world. You know, it's one of the things that we say about the school that Christian was talking about is that the school really is the people who come. And when they're touched deeply enough and they go away, it's they share with the world. They share the same knowledge with the world. So the school really is those who attend. And I remember Christian being very touched. And you know, when you see that, you know that something good is going to come of it. So thank you very much, Christian, for all that you're doing. And hello to everybody. I see 1 or 2 faces I think I recognize, but it's lovely to just be with a whole new group of people. I'll talk a little bit in the beginning about, as Christian asked, the first time I don't really, I'm not used to this terminology, but dropped out of my thinking. I hear other people use that. And it's a nice phrase, it really is. Just a quick bit of background. I grew up in a home filled with violence and alcoholism. I was the oldest of 11 kids. And so as the oldest, I went through the thing of when I was a young teenager feeling somehow I had to protect my mother, my brothers, my sisters. And by the time I was a young man, I was pretty angry, aggressive young man. You know? And then I was fortunate enough to meet my beautiful wife, Jan. And it's a funny thing, you know, falling in love and discovering the principles actually is very similar, right? When I met Jan, I literally forgot about all that stuff and my depression and my anger. And we had 2 or 3 really happy years, but slowly my background, my worldview started to come to the surface again, and it pretty much destroyed our marriage. And when Jan, my wife, first met Sid Banks, we were pretty much finished. You know, we were still living in the same house, but our relationship was finished. But Jan quite accidentally met Sid Banks. And she had a profound experience. And someday maybe she can tell you the story, but just quickly, she ended up in his living room by accident. She was traveling with some people who knew him, and she didn't know that she was going to end up here. And she went into this beautiful room by the sea, and there were, I think, about 5 or 6 couples there. And Sid Banks was sitting there. She'd heard the name, but she didn't really know what it was all about. And people were just making social conversation. And all of a sudden it shifted, and Sid was talking about the true nature of life. And as he was talking, at one point, he looked at Jan, my wife, and he said, if everybody here could see how truly beautiful they are on the inside, their problems would disappear. And Jan really heard that. I mean, she really heard it. She described it as having the feeling of seeing her life spread before and knowing that it was going to be okay, that it was going to be beautiful, including our marriage, which to me at the time would have been inconceivable, you know. And the other thing that experience that she had in that moment, she was listening to this and full of feelings. Then she suddenly realized and had the insight that what she was seeing wasn't coming from Sidney Banks. The wisdom wasn't coming from Sidney Banks. It was coming from within her. She was recognizing some truth, some understanding. And I think that's really important. That's what Sid sought to share with everybody, was that they had that within them, that it wasn't his words. It was their own insights as a result of listening. Right? So anyway, I'm at home looking after our son. We actually lived on a smaller island near this island near Salt Spring. And I was in a grouchy mood because I was at home looking after our son. And I don't know what's going on. And Jan comes home that evening, and she just looks different. She's full of these feelings, and she starts telling me, basically, that all of our problems are just thought. And I'm like, you've got to be kidding. No way. This is ridiculous, you know. And we ended up in an argument. I was just telling her it's not that simple. Life is hard. You have to study for a long time. You have to find somebody who really sees and be with them for a long time. And at the time, excuse me, I was considered myself as a Buddhist, and I spent a lot of time on my knees. And I resented the idea that all the time I'd spend on my knees was that you could just go and listen to somebody for 20 minutes and have a profound insight. So what happened from that was we had this little argument, and Jan, I could see her getting upset, but then I saw something I was going to see many times in the future. I saw her just settle back, and there was just a change. And she just looked at me and said, well, I think I'll take a walk. And she walked out, and this really, really upset me. Right? So she came home later, and we had this quiet evening because I didn't want to talk, and I thought this was really silly, and I was sure it would go away. And we went to bed that night. I woke up in the morning, and I could hear singing coming from the kitchen. Right? And I'm like, there's no singing in my house. What's going on here, you know? And once again, Jan tried to tell me about this experience, and I wouldn't have it. I would not listen to it. And so, to make a long story short, over the next 3 or 4 weeks, I would try to upset Jan. Now, this is hindsight, okay? I would try to upset her. I would try to get her back where I knew her, right? Where I had the handles on the relationship. And I would throw these things that I knew would upset her and say these things. And in the beginning, I would see her get a little bit upset, right? But I'd always see that moment when she just settled back and just, it would enrage me because then she would say, instead of arguing with me, she would say, well, can I fix you a cup of tea? No, I don't want a cup of tea. I want you to argue with me about this, right? And the last time it happened, I threw out what I call the bright red button, that I knew would really upset her. Right? And then I just threw it out there. And she did, she got upset and she started to tear up. And then she just did the same thing. She just got quiet and peaceful and she looked at me, she said, I'm not going there anymore. And it was not arguing, it was very gentle, right? And I thought, well, that's it. Now we do have to separate. How can I have my wife walking around being happy all the time? It's ridiculous. And the thing that changed me, that changed me in the sense of being willing to look at what Sid was saying, was that over those weeks, I began to understand that Jan's change was permanent, that it was sustainable, that it was real. Because at first I just thought it was an act, it'll go away. But it never did. And the confusion that it caused slowly turned to curiosity as I saw the permanence of that change. And I saw that she was healthier and happier with our son, with our friends. And part of me didn't want to see that. And part of me knew that I was looking at something I'd never seen before. Right? So I finally started to listen. And I had an experience of talking to somebody who had also been in that room with Jan. And I won't go through that. It's kind of a long story, but she said to me at one point, I was giving her an argument about Sid, and she said to me at one point, this woman said, Chip, the only thing that stands between you and Jan and all the happiness in this world is thought. And I was going to say, oh, what a stupid thing to say. But I happened to look over her shoulder and saw Jan, and this feeling just rushed in. And I was filled with emotion that I hadn't experienced in a long time. And in my head, this is how I described the insight I had at that moment. It was like all of our arguments were these little piles in my head, all this fighting and arguing. And I remember thinking, well, of course they're just thought. What else could they be? But then I shut it down, right? Like, no way. And I was rude and left. So I had this curiosity, and I listened to, I think, one tape of Sid's. And the first real experience of really dropping out of my thought was like this. I got up one morning. I was sitting in a chair reading, and Jan, my wife, was on the floor with her son, who was maybe 5 at the time, 4 or 5. And it was very early morning, and the light was coming in at a steep angle through the window, and it was in their hair. It sort of caught my attention. And I looked at them, and that same feeling just rushed in, just filled me. And I looked, and I remembered the only thought I had was, all I have to do is surrender. There's nothing to do. And literally everything in our life changed at that moment. Now, it was quite a while before I realized what that moment was. That was my first experience of seeing without all of my thinking. I didn't see my thinking about Jan, my thinking about our situation, my thinking about my son. I saw Jan, I saw my son, and it filled me with this amazing feeling. And like I say, it took a while for me to understand what that was. I'm still trying to understand it in some ways. But I know that that was the first time, as Christian put it, that I truly dropped out of my thinking and saw what was really in front of me. Not my thinking, but what was really in front of me. And I describe that as seeing. The way I've come to understand life in a way is that there are always two worlds happening at once. The world that we see through the lens of our thinking, our experience, our conditioning, and the true world. And the true world is a quiet world where we see what's truly before us, right? Not what we interpret it to be through our experience. So no matter what's going on, I see that, I mean, this is 45, 46 years later for me, and I still have my days when I get lost in my thinking, and, you know, it doesn't happen nearly as much and it doesn't last long. But in a way, it's fascinating to watch myself go in and out, you know, of having that beautiful, grateful feeling for being able to see a true world, and then just getting caught up in my thinking again, and just, you know, we all do it. We all do it. But I know for sure that it's not being in a high state of mind all the time. Right? Sid said to me once, I asked him about that. I asked him, you know, like, when will I get to the point where I'm just, you know, great all the time, happy all the time? He laughed. He said, you won't. I was very disappointed, right? He said, how about this? He said, it's not about being in a high state of mind all the time. It's about learning to go in and out of separate realities with grace. And I love that. That frees you from all the judgment of yourself. You see that you're human, you have some conditioning, you have a past, but you also have a true self. And when you slip into your conditioning, you're just kinder to yourself. You know, you just see that humanity, and we're all part of it. And there's a patience. And so when we see that, and we don't judge ourselves too much, and we don't, you know, be upset about the fact that we lost it, we come out of it sooner. You know, we rise sooner. So that was kind of my first experience with, as they say, dropping out of your thinking. Where I say, see.
Excuse me, Chip. Could you go a little bit closer to the microphone?
Oh, sure, yeah. Just a little closer. Is that better?
Yeah, that's okay. You don't have to move a lot, but I'm sorry interrupting.
No, that's all right. I'm glad you did, Jens.
Yeah.
Everybody can hear okay now?
Yeah, it's fine now. Thank you.
I know I have a soft voice, so it's a little tricky.
Yeah, that's okay.
So did you all get a sense of what Christian said about dropping out of your thinking in that conversation? Great. You know, it's something you can't force, you can't make yourself do from the intellect, but you can be open to it. You can be open to it. And, you know, there are no techniques or models with the principles to find something. But what I do know is that listening is magical. There's a secret about really deep listening. And maybe I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that in a moment. But the thing about really listening at a deep level is there's a simple mathematical fact about it. You cannot listen purely and deeply and think at the same time. They are mutually exclusive activities, right? And so when we learn to listen, not to somebody in particular, just listen, we open ourselves up to that moment when the world that we're projecting moment to moment on a constant basis just stops for a split second. And when that happens, that's what people call an insight in the three principles world. That's when we see something brand new, something that's not derivative of our thinking. And you know it when you see it, because it's always accompanied by an absolutely beautiful feeling. So listening to me is, if there's a technique, it's that willingness to listen at a really deep level. Right? And when I talk about that with clients, sometimes they'll say, well, I mean, that's how I should listen to Sid, you know? Well, sure, like, you're not, in a way, you're not listening to Sid, you're just listening. And if you listen deeply enough, you'll find yourself listening to your own true self. Sid is just pointing in a certain direction. He's pointing inside. I heard somebody say once that the best way to listen to wisdom or to truth is to listen in the same way that we listen to music. You know, when we listen to music, we don't go, why did he put that note after that one? You know, we just listen. We just enjoy the feeling of the music. And I think that's the same. Like if you could listen to Sid's recordings or whoever you choose to listen to without an objective, without a goal, then you would hear more for sure. Because the objective and the goal is where your thinking is. You know, you're still not listening at that deeper level. The door to the land of knowledge is opened by dropping, like Christian says, dropping out of your thinking. Just being present in the moment, in the now, right now. I was talking to a client yesterday who was asking sort of a similar question, like, well, when do I get to a place where I'm just like happy all the time? And I said, well, I'll tell you the story that Sid told me about that. I was asking a similar question about what he described as levels of consciousness, levels of understanding. And I was asking, like, how does that work? Like you find this really deep level, but then you find yourself in your thinking again, you know? I said, so don't worry about that. Don't worry about it. He said, here's what it's really like. He said, your mind gets quiet and you're still, and suddenly you find yourself in this beautiful room that you've never seen before. And it's so beautiful that you stand up and you walk around and you look at everything in that room. And each thing you look at brings you more understanding and joy. You love the room. You absolutely love it. And you walk around and you look at everything in that room. Right? He said, then you feel a little tired and you sit down. And you sit down and you look across the room and there's a door. You go, oh, didn't see that. He said, then you walk over to the door and you open it and there's this incredibly beautiful room. Right? And you walk into that room and you walk around and everything in it just fascinates you. It's just beautiful and it touches you. And you're so grateful to be able to see what's in that room. And you walk around and you look at everything in that room. Right? At some point you sit down to rest and you look across the room and there's a door. And that's really what finding your true self is like. There's always more. Always, no matter what you find, there'll always be more and more understanding. What you have within you is endless. Absolutely endless. Christian, could you remind me of the other things you asked about?
I think that the main issues that I would like to emphasize here would be the grounding. You could talk a little bit also about the birth of the genesis of the principles, what you did together with Elsie. Because what I think is very important is that really to have the perspective and the context of the principles in order with the persons that are really interested in the principles, because I think it is that constitutes a foundation that really is worth building on, because that's solid. So if you could talk a little bit about that, I think that would be great, please.
Sure. Elsie first came up with the idea of doing that video. We had started to get concerned because we were traveling around the world and both of us had in different places at the same time, basically. We started to have this experience of talking to people who were learning about the principles, but had never heard of Sydney Banks. And I go, what? You know? And at first that was just a puzzlement, you know, but it was pretty prevalent. There was quite a few people we met that were studying the principles with somebody, but had never really heard of Sydney Banks, never listened to his recordings or read his books. So that was very curious to us. You know? And it got us thinking, got Elsie thinking about putting out a video for one really specific reason. The reason being that through the years, a few people have said, you shouldn't put Sid on a pedestal, you shouldn't, and that's true, you shouldn't. He's just a person, However, what came through him was mystical, it was profound, and it was a profound occurrence. So if you only look at the principles through the lens of what they mean intellectually for psychology or whatever, you're only getting part of the story. You're only getting part of the experience, because I still marvel at the idea that a man with a sixth grade education, no experience with consciousness raising or religion or anything, in the middle of this little island, just boom, had this experience, And the way I describe it, this is my personal description of it, he had the experience of his personality completely dying for a moment. He described it as a death, where one moment he had all his beliefs and his ideas and his judgments about people in the world, and they fell away. And he had this beautiful experience where he saw through no lens really, and felt this profound feeling of love for the world. He described that he was awake for 3 days after, and just was nothing but beauty coming into him. Now, see, that experience is not intellectual. These words are loaded, that people take them in different ways, but it's a mystical, spiritual experience. My personal belief is that every once in a while on this planet, wisdom somehow finds a way to come through when we're in trouble, when we're moving in the wrong direction. And that's what I feel happened with Sid Banks. So when we did the video, we wanted to emphasize the fact that there is an understanding of the principles that's going to be, it is already very helpful to the world of psychology. But there's something in it, in that story, that describes our true nature. Right? What Sid saw in that moment was his true nature, his spiritual nature. Right? That whatever it is, like I personally don't believe in a separate God, an entity, so to speak. I respect if somebody does, but on the other hand, there is this profound intelligence behind everything, in my view. And it's not out there anywhere. It's available to us when our minds are quiet enough. Right? And so there's a spiritual or mystical, whatever you want to call it, side to this story, that experience that revealed the principles. Sid Banks didn't invent the principles. He uncovered them. That experience, that mystical experience of dropping out of his idea of himself, his personality, completely. And as I said, he described it as dying. Allowed him to see all of life without the filter of a individual thought system. And that's why we wanted to do that video, because we could see that people were only looking to the intellectual. They weren't recognizing the fact that something spiritual happened, which was evidence of what was available inside of us, inside of everybody. So that's really what that recording was about. And I think if you don't look at the mystical part of it, at whatever came through to help us see and understand, I think it loses some power. The power is when you get quiet enough to see that exists within you. And most of us have had these moments in our life where that's kind of come through. We haven't really recognized it as our true self. Sid's experience defines the true nature of being human. That we have an intellect, we have a mind, but we also have a deeper understanding and natural wisdom about life. One of my favorite experiences about this was my first grandson was born. And after a few weeks, my daughter and son-in-law were so exhausted, they could barely speak on the phone because they weren't sleeping right. And so Jan and I went to kind of help out a little bit for a couple of weeks. And the very first night we were there, about 2 a.m, I heard the baby crying. And I tapped on the door and my daughter said, come in. And she was feeding him. And I said, look, when you're done, let me take him downstairs so you can go right back to sleep. She said, oh, that'd be great, Dad, right? So I take the baby and I go downstairs and got one lamp on in the living room and I'm holding the baby. And I'm thinking, oh, this is nice, you know. And then I looked into his eyes and it really hit me that I was looking at pure consciousness. You know, no learning yet, no conditioning yet, no beliefs yet, just pure consciousness. And it really hit me. You know, it just really struck me that that's what Sid was talking about. And that's what that experience showed him. That this consciousness that exists before intellectual learning, it has intelligence and it has wisdom and it understands, you know, perhaps not in the language that we put it in, but it definitely understands. So that's what that Genesis video was about. And also, as we talk through it, you'll see that we're describing, I find this still fascinating. We're describing a very simple man who lived in very ordinary ways throughout to the end of his life, who had this profound knowledge at the same time. And I just find that really fascinating. Like if you would have met Sid Banks at the grocery store, you would have met a really friendly, you know, seemingly carefree person. Maybe you would have seen something else, maybe not, but you would have seen a very ordinary person on the surface. And he used to say to us, he used to say, if you really want to see who and what you are, be ordinary. Don't try and be something special. Don't try. Because of course, he was talking to me who was driving myself crazy with studying Buddhism and so on. But there was something about the fact that he was such an ordinary fella, you know, ordinary working person who on 1 second would be talking about cutting his lawn and the next second would be talking about the energy of all things and the true nature of life. I love that juxtaposition. You know, it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So yeah, we produced that because we wanted to emphasize that we're not putting Sydney Banks, the man, on the pedestal, but we are raising up that experience that came through him. Yeah. And that's an important thing to see, like the source of that. You know? And as I've watched over the years, and I know you all have seen this too, especially if you've been around it a little while, the same process seems to happen in every environment. Like when Sid first had his experience, his family thought he was insane for sure. You know, they talked about what are we going to do with him. You know, like this ordinary guy is always already suddenly saying that he has the answer to psychology, that he understands the true nature of life and God, and like the family's like, oh boy, we got a problem, right? But the same thing happened. They felt that way at first, but then they saw this different person, you know, who was able to live without judgment for the most part, and just had this amazing feeling about him, was healthy, and eventually their confusion turned to curiosity, and they began to listen. And his wife at the time, his first wife, had passed away. Barb had insights and began to realize that he wasn't crazy, you know, that this was something. And it moved through his family and then to people on the island. And it's that example. So through the years, we've seen it over and over again. Like my wife and I did about 3 years of work in the prison system in Florida with inmates. We worked with inmates. And the same thing would happen. Like the first time we worked in this women's prison, and it's an interesting place because, you know, I assumed that women's prison was going to be softer, gentler, you know, but they had their gangs, they had violence. I mean, it was really a learning experience for me, right? But literally the same thing happened. The first class that Jan and I did, we met these 4 or 5 women who are waiting at the door. They were there. They were supposed to help us set up and everything. And they couldn't look at us. They would just look at their feet and kind of glance up at us. They were so full of shame and guilt and all of that, right? And after the first class, we played a video at the end of the class, one of the videos. And we came back the next week thinking, well, that was an okay start, you know, they didn't throw us out or they didn't call us names or anything, right? But it was very quiet. We came back the next week and these 2 women were waiting for us at the door. And one of them said, I had a strange experience. And we said, well, what's that? And she said, I went to bed a couple of nights ago in my bunk and I suddenly sat straight up and realized that I had created the life that I'm in and that I could create any life I want. And it put chills through me, right? And what happened was she and her friend who also started to have insights, they changed so much that our little class had a long waiting list within a couple of weeks because they had never seen that. Nobody had ever seen that happen in a prison. Like somebody find real happiness and health. That was so, and it confused the hell out of all of their friends and out of the corrections officers. They didn't know what was going on. This is just, she'd heard one recording, right? And so at first, everybody in that prison was really confused or suspicious that this will go away, you know. Remember what I said about Jan? They were saying the same thing. This will go away, right? But it didn't. Right? And then more and more people got it. And that living example is really how it moves throughout the world, right? The living example. So when people ask, well, how do you share this with the world? There are many ways to share it. But the thing that's primary that Christian mentioned is grounding. Because people see and feel your grounding, right? They sense that you have that solidness. Like in that prison, the rest of the women sensed that something profound had shifted in those first few people, right? They could see it. They could feel it, right? And that's what brought people to open their ears and shift from confusion to true curiosity. Like, what is this? What is this? You know? And so the living of it, what Christian referred to as grounding, is the absolute root of sharing. So he used to say, be selfish. Get it for yourself first. Don't worry about anybody else for a while. Listen. Find your own insights. And the other thing he would say is find your own voice. Like if you share from what you've seen yourself in your heart, your insights, it'll be unique. It'll still be about a truth and understanding, but your way of sharing it would be unique. And Sid really respected that. He would say, find your own voice. I love that. So that same phenomena of people changing and other people being confused and then curious, it happened in business. Jan and I worked in many large corporations, sharing this in the business world. And it was the same thing. You know, there'd be 1 or 2 people out of a group of 15 top managers who get a real insight. And it would create a stir and then a curiosity. And quite often, quite a bit of confusion, you know. But it was the same process. You know, people get curious because there's something in them that sees something that they know. And so that makes it easy. We don't have to worry about learning how to share the principles. All we have to do is listen, have our own insights, and share. I mean, there comes a time when you do your best to describe the principles, of course. But if it starts with you sharing what you've seen. A couple of years ago, I had a client that was really wanted to have a practice sharing the principles. And the first conversation we had, she said, you know, I really struggle because I love this, but I really don't know how to describe the principles. When I do, I get all tangled up and I make a mess of it. And she's going on and on and on. And I said, well, tell me what's happening with you right now. Oh, it's wonderful. You know, I used to have a really hard time getting along with my mom and dad. We'd have arguments. That just stopped. It's gone away. I said, oh, that's great. I said, what else? So, oh, my husband and I feel like we're on a honeymoon, you know. She said, I love the principles. I really, you know. And I said, well, what else? She said, oh, my son is just, he's come around. He's doing really well in school. So I'm listening to this. You know. I said, well, that's what you should talk about. Mm-hmm. People, you think that's not a big deal, that it's just your little personal experience, but people aren't used to hearing somebody say, all of those things in my life have changed because I had this little insight. Right? She had a little insight about the role of thought in messing up her life, just a tiny little insight. So, but what you've got to see is that's so unusual, you know, and if it's accompanied by feeling, a solid feeling, then people know what you're saying is something significant, something powerful. And I really encourage everybody to keep it simple and just trust the feeling you have from your own learning. You know, it's and when it comes time to describe the principles, after you share what you know from your heart, you'll find that much easier and much simpler. Well, Christian, I wonder if there are any questions at this point.
Yes, but just before the questions, you have been touching a little bit about on the subject, but could you just say a couple of words about the importance of the purity of the principles?
Sure. The purity and the simplicity, like through the years, all these people would come around and they were very interested. They got something with the principles, but they would want to mix it with what they already knew, you know, with some form of psychology or some form of religion or whatever. And, you know, Sid would say to people who were religious, keep your religion. Don't, you know, don't move away from your religion, but listen in a different way. Listen in a way that really lets you hear the heart of it, the essence of it. In other words, listen for the simplicity. You know, you would say it is so simple. And with psychology, he would be more forthright and say, you won't get the results that you want if you're mixing it with other things, because anytime you introduce a technique or a model, that's where people's minds are going to go. You know, this is simpler than that. If the true self exists, it's truly wise. If the true self exists, it already knows. It's not, we're not learning about the principles. We're realizing what we know about them. The principles aren't something out there. We are the principles. We are mind, consciousness, and thought, right? And so the simpler we keep it, the better. You know, and I know in our work with Elsie and Jan and I, we do our best. That was Sid's charge to us about the school. He said, I want one place where it stays simple. You talk about the principles in the most simple way possible, and you share your experience in the most simple way possible. Now, another way I'll describe that is this. There are many things that we can learn intellectually about the principles. In fact, some of the first things I saw were purely intellectual. Like I heard, so the first thing that really got my attention, listening to one of Sid's recordings, and may have even been live, I don't remember, but I remember him saying, just in passing, he said, all insecurity is an illusion created by thought. Now that really got my attention intellectually. And I remember thinking, if that was only 10 or 20% true, my life would be different, but it was purely intellectual. Now, after I had the experience a couple of times of really getting quiet, I saw that. I remember being in a situation where I was feeling insecure, and then it just stopped. And I went, oh, I could see there was nothing in the environment to be insecure about, and I saw what I was doing, right? It's just so simple. So this is the way that looks to me. We can try and figure out what we're doing with our thinking, the ins and outs of it, and how we hold ourselves back and our habits. We can look at all that. We can look at what we do with thought. Right? But at some point in that investigation, you just stop that and you make a hard right turn and you look inside and you look at what thought is, not what it does. You look at the fact, the spiritual fact that thought is a profound power given to every human being. And it doesn't have form, it's just a pure power, right? And so people talk about insights. So in the beginning, all of us, we make the best we can out of the principles. We look at our thinking, we look at the fact that consciousness goes up and down. We look at what consciousness does. We look at what thought does and how it's manifested in our life. But at some point we get quiet and we just look totally away from it in another direction. And when we get quiet, right, and we look out at this world from that quiet state, from the now, whatever you want to call it, then we see the whole world from a different light, from a different perch, right, from a different level of understanding. So when that happens, that's when we have new thoughts that we had never had before. The quickest example I'll share with you to talk about the simplicity is I told you about the way my dad was, and I'll just qualify this, by the way. My dad eventually understood this, had an insight and changed, which blew my mind completely, absolutely completely. But my first insight about that, when I first went to some of Sid's talks in person, I really enjoyed them except for one thing. Okay? And that's when Sid would start to talk about forgiveness. Right? And I would think to myself, that's great. Intellectually, I understand that if you didn't have all this thought about people you don't forgive, you'd have a quieter mind, blah, blah, blah. But there are some things that are not forgivable. Right? And I would get upset when he would talk about forgiveness. And this happened a couple of times. And the second time he started talking about all kinds of things about the true nature of life, but then he slipped into talking about forgiveness again. And I got upset and I walked out of the talk. And the next morning the phone rings and it's Sid. He said, "Are you okay?" You know? I said, "Yeah, sort of." He said, "What's on your mind?" And so I told him, when you talk about forgiveness, I don't think you understand what I've seen in this life. Or you wouldn't, you would know why there's some things that are not forgivable. He said, "Come on over and have a cup of tea." Okay. So I drive across the aisle and I think I'm going to get a lecture about forgiveness, right? And we sit down and we have this cup of tea and he says, "Okay." This was one of maybe 3 times in 45 years that Sid showed any interest in the details of my life. We just didn't talk about our problems. So I sat down and he said, "Okay, tell me what's not forgivable." So I told him the worst couple of stories I could think of violence and alcohol and how horrible I felt and all that. I just told him the whole thing. It just came all running out of me. And I could see in his face that it really touched him, that he was filled with compassion. I thought, well, finally he understands. Right? And then we were quiet for a few minutes and he looks at me and says, "Chip," excuse me. He said, "Your father must have really been suffering to have done those things." And I just went, "You just don't get it. You just don't get it." Right? And I thanked him and I left. Well, that night, I went to bed and Jan had fallen asleep. And I was still thinking about all of this. And then for some reason, I thought of something really cruel and mean I'd said to Jan before this change. And that feeling like, oh, if I could only go back in time and take that back and never have said that. I was feeling really bad, like, oh God, how could you have said that, right? And then this peaceful feeling just washed over me, right? And the insight, this is the best I can describe it, was I thought to myself, that belongs in this world over here, right? You don't live in that world anymore. It's not part of the world that you live in now. And I just remember feeling just a tremendous feeling of gratitude. Right? And I fell asleep and I slept for like 10 or 11 hours, which is not like me. I sleep 6 or 7 hours, right? And when I woke up, I felt really different, and I couldn't get my finger on it. I knew I felt completely different, but I really wasn't sure why or what it was. I knew I'd had a nice experience that night, but I really didn't understand it. A couple of weeks later, I was in the same position. Jan was asleep, I'm still awake. And for some reason, I started to think about my dad, right? And I went right back to our last encounter, which was violent on both of our parts. I was about 17, right? And I literally was reliving it. I could feel the bile rising in my chest. I felt the hatred. I felt the anger. I mean, it was just there. And again, it just stopped. It just stopped. And I felt that peace again. And I had this insight. In that quiet, I saw that my father was living in a world that was handed to him. He didn't know there's anything outside the boundaries of that world. And I just happened to be born in his house. Right? And I just teared up and just felt this amazing relief. Right? Once again, I slept long hours. And I woke up the next morning and I felt truly different. Only this time I had a sense and understanding of what was different. Can you imagine the volumes and volumes and volumes of thinking and ways of interacting with the world and habits that were involved in that relationship? You know, just volumes. And the reason I felt so light is those volumes had dropped away. And along with it, the anger, the aggression. I'll just say this. I mean, it sounds like bragging, but I don't remember more than once or twice ever being even slightly angry since that moment. It just fell away. It just fell away. Now, here's the simplicity of that. I could have studied my thinking about that. I could have tried to sort it out. I could have tried to see how I was living at the end of my thinking. But what actually happened was in that quiet, in that insight, I was actually looking at my experience and my world from a different place, from a completely new perspective, from a quiet. I was just looking at it as is, right? And because I was looking from that quiet, I saw new information. The idea that my dad was innocent and lost had never in my life remotely occurred to me. That was brand new, right? Brand new. And what really caught me off guard that night is after I had that thought, I started having these feelings of love from my father. And that just really shocked me. But that's the simplicity of it. You can do certain things to help you with your thinking, like notice some things and, you know, be aware of it. But if you go to that quiet, if you take it in a split second and truly stop the world, then you look back at the world in freedom. You look back at that world from a quiet, clean place, and you see it with a completely new understanding. And the beauty of that is that a true insight like that, one of the hallmarks of that true insight from inside is that it generalizes in your life. You know, like in that experience, for sure, I saw my father's innocence. I saw my own innocence, which was also a big part of it. But that gave me the deeper insight to really see everybody's psychological innocence. Now, I'm not telling you I do that all the time. I get caught up sometimes too. But when the feeling is right, I do see that everybody is truly innocent, psychologically innocent. You know, and to me, that there's something so simple about dropping out of analyzing and seeing. They're two completely different things. You will never come to the end of analyzing. You will never come to the end of trying to figure it out. But if you have a split second when you look at it from innocence, from quiet, you'll understand it all in a completely different way. And that's, everybody here, I'm sure, has had insights, and one degree or another, you begin to see that. It begins to open up the true world. So that's profoundly simple to me. You get quiet and you look. You listen. You find the quiet. You slip into the now. Right? The now, the true self, the meditative state, all the same thing. And all available within each of us.
Do you have a time? Do we have time for a couple of questions?
I have all the time you want today.
Lovely. Would you manage the questions, please, Sanna?
Yes, absolutely. If any of you have a question, please wave at me and I'll try to see you. Or maybe you can just unmute yourself and ask the question, or if you have a comment, that'll be fine too.
Or if you have your own insights to share, I'd love to hear as well.
Maybe I could just start, Chip, because I just reread the Missing Link by Sydney Banks.
Beautiful.
And even though I've read it several times, I was actually very surprised this time how much he talks about forgiveness, especially in the last part of it. And it was just so beautiful. I had the insight that when we forgive, it's not about the action. It has nothing to do about the action, but it's about recognizing the other person's oneness with us and with the whole universe. Yeah, so beautiful. I just love that book.
That was a beautiful way to put it. Oh, I think we have a question somewhere. Did I hear somebody?
Yes, please just unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment. I can't see everybody on one screen, so. No questions? I think maybe people are just in such a good feeling with your sharing, Chip, so the intellect has stopped, so no questions will appear.
Or if anybody's had an insight that they experienced in their life that they wanted to share, it helps me to hear that. Don't all talk at once, it's disturbing.
Can I talk?
Yes,
absolutely.
Please.
Hi, I'm Anton from Sweden.
From Sweden.
Yeah, I came in touch with the three principles, say 3 months ago. I'm totally into it, and I had it the first 10 hours. Then I was, as I said, home. But I still have an issue, and that is the life in me, who I am, how I think, how I behave. That's not the issue so much anymore. But the issue I have is to be out in the movie, what so-called the life, to be in action with other people and to connect with other people with the new thoughts and insights that I have. How would you explain that to me? I am what I am in the three principles. I don't have no doubts that the thought is the thought, but still the movie is going on. And sometimes I have to participate in the movie.
As we all do, for sure, for sure. Kind of the way I look at that, Anton, is you have insights, you begin to understand the nature of the game of life and how it's played. And we have no choice. Once we have insights, we still have to go back and live life. We have to interact with everybody else. We have to be part of, if you want, the part of the movie, part of the illusion. But when you have that understanding, you also have a sense of humor about the game of life, and you see people's behavior with psychological innocence. You realize it, and so there's this, for me, there's just this kind of curiosity where you go back and you live life and you do your best, and sometimes you act out of what you've seen and your new insights, and sometimes you're back in your thinking and so on. But we have to play the game of life. We just learn to play it better. And part of what, for me, I'll just speak for myself, was really important is I had to see early on that the fact that I'd come across the principles and had my insights didn't mean that I knew anything more than anybody else. They just hadn't realized it yet. That knowledge was within all of them. It changed the way I listened to people and the way that I looked at them. It became fascinating to me, and still is, still is. So you go back into this life and you play it with more understanding. You still have to play the game. You have to go to work. You have to do your job. You have to interact with other people, but you do it with more understanding and with more love and compassion. And to me, it's fascinating, you know, like having some understanding is fascinating. You see the game of life. And many times I've had this experience where you're in the play, you're part of the play, and you're reading your part of the script, you're really into it. And then for some reason you step back and you're in the audience. And you see with kindness and love, everybody playing their part, right? And it allows you to go back in and play it at a higher level, at a more loving level, right? And then you're surprised because some people are touched by that and they shift, and some people don't. It's just the way it is. I'll be honest with you. I lost a lot of my friends in the beginning. I did. I was a musician, and I had a lot of friends in that world. And we played a lot of music together. We did a lot of drinking together, a lot of complaining about the world, a lot of complaining about our partners. That was the world I lived in before we gained understanding. And when I began to shift, I still wanted to play music with my friends, but it was weird. It was like I stopped drinking. I just wasn't interested anymore. I just stopped, you know. And I had no interest in complaining about the world and politics and my wife and all of that stuff. And my friends, I think, took that as a judgment. Not that I was saying they shouldn't, or I never did. But the fact that I wouldn't participate in that, it just didn't interest me anymore. They took it as judgment, and I started noticing that I wasn't getting invited to jam sessions and stuff. And so those friends dropped away. Not all of them. Some of them are here on the island I'm close to now, because some of them saw the same insights. But yeah, our life does change. The beauty of that was, though, that then I started meeting people that were operating at a much higher level of consciousness. And my friends all around me changed, right? And some of those early friends that were musician friends changed as well. But I lost quite a few friends in the beginning. It's funny now that I'm in my 70s, I'm back here on Salt Spring, and I'm actually seeing some of them, and it's fun now. They don't want to hear about it, believe me.
Yeah.
I don't go there. But that's okay, because we just have a lighthearted hello and how are you doing? And
Hello.
You know.
I experienced that too, because my cousin told me.
Hello.
Hvad gjorde du der?
Det ved jeg ikke.
Jane, kan du unmute dig?
Yeah, now I'm back.
Yeah.
Yeah, I experienced that. I've been speaking a lot to my cousin. She's pretty much my age, 50 about. And after several years of discussions, she suddenly told me, you know what? You're not interesting anymore.
Sorry.
I also laughed, but that's exactly what she said.
Yeah, yeah.
You're becoming boring somehow.
Yeah,
because
what my
I wasn't
said.
playing. I wasn't playing the game that I used to play.
Right.
the discussions were always about problems, issues, and stuffs about people, about the other in our family, and but suddenly I stopped complaining. And it wasn't interesting to me anymore.
Exactly.
So I experienced that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I'm glad you brought that up, Anton. I'll mention one more thing about that. In the beginning, the small group of people, I think maybe 12 or 15 people who were really interested in SID, we all became friends, of course. And then we talked about the principles constantly, you know, the principles this, the principles that, and my true self this and my true self that. So one day we were at Sid's for a barbecue, and he was actually flipping hamburgers on the grill. And we were all sitting around and we're going on and on about, am I thinking this, am I thinking that, and the true self, and we're just yakking away about it, and this person's understanding that. And all of a sudden Sid said, quit talking about that stuff. What? You know? And he looked at us and he said, if you don't stop thinking about it and talking about it all the time, you're never going to see what you've learned. You're never going to see what you've been given. And it was so true, you know, like Jen and I then just pulled back from it. That didn't mean that when we went to a talk or we, you know, were with some friends, we didn't have some conversations about it. But it went along with what he would say about when you discover this, be ordinary. Like just be an ordinary person. Be careful not to think that you're special because you know, right? And don't talk about it all the time or you'll lose it. And Jen and I took that to heart and it changed everything. That was like the next level of learning for us as we got quieter about it and just would notice what we were noticing. And we talk a little bit between ourselves, but we stopped talking about it all the time. And I see now I have young clients who tell me about, they've been to like 9 courses in the last 3 weeks and they read this and they read that and they talk about it constantly. And I say, you know, take a couple of weeks and, you know, listen to some recordings, but stop looking everywhere because the principles can turn into another search very easily, you know. So that was very helpful when Sid said they quit talking about it. And it helped a lot just to be ordinary and to begin to see what I saw when I was washing the dishes or cutting my grass or walking my dog or playing music with my wife. You know, that it's in those beautiful, quiet, ordinary moments when you really see what you've been given. So I thought that's kind of part of what you asked, I think, is that, you know, like, I actually have this one client where I said, I could see he was driving himself nuts and literally spending money, didn't have to go to every course he could find, right? I said, he asked me for a recommendation. I said, turn off your computer for 2 weeks. Don't go online except for work and just listen and read and just quit thinking about everything out there. And at the end of 2 weeks, I saw a completely different person, I swear. You know, and he was very touched. So it's something worth noting, you know. But thanks for that question. That was great.
Thank you.
Chip, just before we end, there's Peter Lindgren. He has written you a question in the chat.
Okay.
So could you just read that and answer that? And then I know the hour is...
okay, I got to figure out how to look at the chat here.
I think it's in the bottom of your screen.
Yeah, my problem is, you know, my strip that has all of my icons at the bottom isn't going away for some reason. So it's covering up. What color is the chat box? Is it green?
Here it's just gray.
Okay, I'm going to try here. I can just see the top. Here we go. I think I'll be able to do this.
Janet, could you read it?
I haven't. I can't see the question. Peter wrote it privately.
I got it.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Hello, Chip. My question is, what is your feeling about the different direction? What I mean is 3P against 3P paradigm. Is there any difference? I actually don't know how to answer that. I hear about the 3P paradigm. I have to be honest here. I don't listen to a lot of stuff throughout the community. I just listen to Sid. I guess my advice would be listen to the originator and find your own answer to that question, and trust yourself. Trust yourself. So yeah, I limit what I listen to be honest, And I know something about the 3P paradigm. I know it's from Keith Levins, I believe. I know Keith quite well. He's a beautiful person. But I don't really know how to answer the difference between that. I know that the 3 principles are the 3 principles, no matter how anybody else wants to talk about them. They are the source of life. They are the source of this experience for all of us. Universal mind, universal consciousness, and universal thought. Now, I can tell you what Sid said about paradigms, because I remember a very specific comment that he made. He said that a new paradigm cannot be seen from an old paradigm, which points to finding that moment when your mind is totally quiet. That's when you see the new paradigm. Right? And the principles are a new paradigm in that sense. The principles are not a form of psychology. The principles are a profound foundation that life is based on, and they inform psychology as to what human beings really are. Like in the simplest terms, if you were to understand as a therapist that every human being, regardless of their current condition, has a true self within them that's solid and sees and understands, you would definitely treat them differently. You would spend less time on their specific issues and more time showing them who and what they are on the inside. So in that sense, it's definitely a paradigm shift for psychology. It's not a very good answer, but that's my best.
It's beautiful, Chip.
Sanne, må jeg lige sige noget?
Yes.
Eller er der en anden?
No. Go ahead, Trine.
Men jeg siger det lige på dansk. Det var ikke så lang tid, hvis der er en af jer, gider oversætte det. Fordi jeg har fået fordi jeg har fået en indsigt nu her, mens vi sidder her, og det er, at jeg har gået på kurser og læst bøger og alt muligt i, hvordan man skulle finde sin passion her i livet. Og det slår mig bare lige pludselig, at det er jo pisselig gyldigt, fordi når du først falder i 3P-gryden, så går du jo ind i livet med passion. Det var bare det.
Trina just wanted to tell you that she had an insight listening to you today, Chip, because she's been on a lot of classes and read a lot of books about finding your passion in life. But when you realize how life is by the 3 principles, it doesn't matter to find your passion because you will go out and live with passion. So it's there already.
Beautiful. I love that. Yeah. It's so true.
Yeah. There's also a Maria who says that she is, oh, sorry.
Oops.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened to my TV. It just turned on by itself. It was Maria, and she says that you really touched her today. She especially loved your comment about go back and be a part of the game. Just play it better with love. That really touched her. And she sends her love to you and Jan and wishes you a Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Yeah. Merry Christmas to all, for sure.
Yeah.
And I see Oscar has a question.
Please just unmute yourself, Oscar.
He says he doesn't have a mic. I'm not sure how that works.
Oh. Has he written you a question in the...
I'll read it. I'm not sure I completely understand it. I can feel that life is simpler. How to let wisdom forward or listen to wisdom within? Or is it just something we see and happen naturally when we drop fear? I think I understand that. When we get quiet, one of the natural things that happens is we drop fear, right? Because we basically, in essence, we drop the thought of it. I mean, let me explain something that I see, this is the way I see it. Fear, insecurity, anger, hatred, lust, all of those negative feelings, right? There's something in common about all of them. And that is they don't exist without thought. None of those feelings would exist without thought. On the other hand, when we get quiet, when we just, I'll just say it this way, in essence, forgive ourselves and just be quiet for a moment, then the reason we feel that feeling of joy is all of the thought that's supporting the rest is temporarily dropped. And the natural state is a happy state. Like, I don't know if Christian remembers this, but I usually do a joke at the beginning of the school where I say, if I had a magic wand and I could pass it over everybody's head, right, and they'd stop thinking for 3 minutes or 2 minutes, they would immediately feel the feeling of joy. Right? They would immediately feel the feeling of happiness. It is the natural state. So we listen for that moment when we stop the world we're projecting constantly. Right? And when we stop the world, we know that we've done so because that nice feeling comes in. And then we can look back at the world and see it with understanding. But we can't make that happen. That's just more searching. You just be open to it and listen, and eventually that moment comes to you. So I don't know if that answers Oscar's question, but that's the way I see it. You know, that all of those things we go through that are negative, they have to be supported by thought. And the reason we feel that beautiful feeling when we're quiet is basically just the cessation of that thinking and going to the natural state. And there's a couple more here. Just comments about how much people have enjoyed themselves. And somebody talked about not being a follower, and I love that. Sid was he was adamant about that he didn't want any followers around him. And if you acted like a follower, you'd soon find that you weren't around him. You know, he said if you become a follower, you lose your dignity. You know, you get lost in somebody else's dogma. You know, it's true. I've never felt like a follower of Sidney Banks. And a couple of times when I may have acted that way, he corrected it very quickly. You know, like he was only interested in what I saw for myself, not me repeating something I thought he said. And that was one of the reasons that I was so fascinated when I first met him, because I could see he had no interest in followers, and he never did. You know, and in fact, while he was alive, he wouldn't even let an organization form around him. He never. There was a couple that tried and got set up, and he would just knock them down and say, I'm you know. Now, as he was passing, he realized that with his leaving, that it would be good to have an organization that people could come to, because he wouldn't be there. But while he was alive, he didn't want followers or an organization or, you know, any of that, those trappings. And that just showed me something, you know, because before that, I was very interested in finding someone to follow, like the Zen master or whatever. And Sid wouldn't have it.
Chip?
Yes.
Yeah, Sonny here from Sweden.
Oh, there you are. I see you, Sonny.
Yeah. I just would like to share something that could be of interest and value for people like myself, and there is a lot of them here in Scandinavia, you know, and what I'm talking about is that as a child, I was conditioned a technical mind. Seeing is believing, and how strong protection there is in the psyche of this, in all of us. So when I encountered the three principles, and after a while, when I saw that there is really something here, really interesting here, and it started to drop into me, and it increased my resilience step by step, and that made a huge difference in my life and with all the clients I was working with, sharing the principles. But the funny thing is, and the amazing thing is, that several years within this knowledge, I didn't see the spiritual message there. It's really amazing how the psyche works. I didn't see it, but still it made a big difference in my life. And what made the difference one day, for like some years ago, making me see the spiritual and going deeper into the message and the groundings, and a lot of things have happened much faster after I saw it and open up for it. And what made me come to that point where I suddenly opened up, and it was that I was humble enough of having so many synchronicity stories in my life. I don't know if you know the synchronicity.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. It's when things are happening so, what do you call it? So the chances are so small it would happen, but still it happens.
Yeah.
And I have had so much of this, and both in small sizes, but in actuality that happens that is impossible to explain it, really. And that made me in the final so humble enough to open up for the world of spirituality. And I'm so happy for that.
I'm sorry?
And I'm so happy for that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really true. Like, I have young clients that say, well, how did you get to do all these things all over the world and have all these experiences? And I tell them, I don't know. It just became, you know. And I tell people, I've never marketed. I've never sought anything that we did. They come to your doorstep and you live in the feeling, that synchronicity that you just don't know. Just quickly, I was traveling to see a business client once. I was at the airport. Jan dropped me off. And I kept thinking, boy, I've got lots of time. I was reading. And then at one point I realized my watch had stopped. I went, oh, and I went, and my flight was gone. But it wasn't a big deal because there was a flight about 3 hours later going to the same place. And I wasn't starting till the next day. So, okay. So I went looking for a place to get something to eat, and the airport was packed. And every restaurant was completely filled. I was looking the door of this one little place, and this fellow looks at me in the city, got a table by himself, and he goes, oh, that's very nice of him. I sat down with him. Long story short, he was a business leader who I had as a client for 7 years, right? We just sat there and have lunch, and he got touched by something and gave me his card and said, call me when you get back. So, you know, how do you explain that? You know, you don't. That there definitely is, I call it the magic carpet ride. When you have that deep faith and you just enjoy life, things come to you. And I know that I don't want to be too woo-woo, you know, but it really is true that there is a synchronicity to life when you live in that feeling, and when you see that it is spiritual in nature. Well, I have one wee story I wouldn't mind ending with, Christian, if that would be okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. In the first year, the first few months, really, of starting to listen to Sid and going to his talks, you know, it really was magical. And it was an amazing experience, obviously. So one night, a Saturday night, Sid was in rare form. I mean, just really went to describing the spiritual nature of life, our true nature, the true nature of the principles. And I was so filled. And that, I'll be honest, in those days, if I found tears, I would be embarrassed because I still had too much of that macho thing. You know, I didn't want anybody to see me with tears. So that night I was like that, and I kind of got out of the hall quickly and went home. In the morning, the phone rang and Sid said, you know, after dark tonight, we're going to have a barbecue on the beach in front of my house. Do you want to come? I said, oh yeah, that'd be great. So we go down there at dusk and it's getting dark and we're roasting marshmallows on the fire with a few friends and we'd sit by the sea. It was very dark. There was no moon. And everybody was just talking about their families and stuff. And then Sid started, you know, talking about the true nature of life again. And it just really went through me. And at some point I started to weep. I couldn't control it. It was just so amazing. But I still had that thing where I didn't want to see anybody to see me in that state. So I quietly stood up and walked down the beach in the dark. And we came to a log. I came to a log that I could sit on. And I think you must have this in Sweden and in Norway and Denmark as well. It's called bioluminescence, the little lights in the water, little animals in the water that light up. You have that? So I sat on this log and I was looking in the water and it was like stars in the water. I thought, I have never seen that before. I was fascinated by it. And I'm looking at it. I thought, how beautiful is that? And I think it was so dark that, you know, it just made it more beautiful to see these little animals lighting up in the water. And as I was watching it, I just felt that peaceful, quiet feeling. And then I felt Jan sit down beside me, my wife sit down beside me, and we were both looking at this light show and just feeling so fortunate, you know. And then from behind us, we heard, and it was Sid. We could barely see him. It was so dark. And he says, so you pair want to share this with the world, do you? And I'll be really honest, I hadn't thought about that yet. I was just so relieved not to be depressed all the time and that my marriage was better. It hadn't really occurred to me that I wanted to go out and share it with the world yet. And I think Jan was the same, but we both said yes, absolutely. We'd love to share this with the world. So he was quiet for a moment. He said, well, he said, here's what it's like. You take my hand and we'll walk all over this world and we'll find people in various stages of sleep. We'll touch them on the shoulder with love and we'll watch them wake up. He said, there's no life like it. There's no life like it. And that's the truth. There really is no life like it. It's incredible. So thank you all very, very much. I really enjoyed spending this time with you.
So thank you very much, Chip, for showing up. It has been absolutely beautiful. Thank you very much. And I'm sure you have touched a lot of people here tonight.
Well, I feel touched listening to everybody. It's a beautiful group of people.
Cool.
And wonderful that you have each other there and that it's moving into all these different places. So thank you all very much.
Thank you too. Thank you.
Love to Jan.
Yeah.
I will. Yes. Love to Jan.
Yeah. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas. Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas. Thank
Merry
you.
Christmas. Happy New Year.
Bye-bye.
Bye.